Right. Well, I may not have given you long enough. It's always a sign I haven't given you long enough if you come back right at the last moment of the closing minute. So my apologies if you needed a bit more time. But perhaps we can continue the conversation now. And as you'll see, we are now finally recording, a little late, but never mind, eh? Yeah, so service, submission, and sharing joy. Thoughts, reflections, comments arising? Remember that if you go to the bottom and you click on reactions, then you can raise a hand, a yellow hand, but I might be able to spot you if you wave vigorously. Any thoughts or jewels that anybody would like to share from your discussion? Or did you all go off and make a cup of tea? Yes, Barbara. You're on mute there, Barbara.
We were looking at the issues arising from the fact that so much of the haste is programmed into us right from childhood. And there are also, in certain situations, penalties. You know, the illustration that was used, a midwife, you know, can't necessarily sort of sit back and just sort of let things go.
Yeah.
The social conditioning has a lot to do with it. Yeah.
No, there are certain scenarios, indeed certain roles that to counsel, you know, a slowing down, it would be to counsel, you know, the process of being unemployed potentially. And of course, there are other situations like running for a plane when it's probably a good idea to hurry up. But yeah, no, I think you're right. We are certainly conditioned by and large to be hasty, which is why it's always striking when you come across cultures where they honor and value the opposite. So for instance, who's that New Testament scholar who talks about the context in which Jesus spoke? Kenneth Bailey. He talks about how when he was in the Middle East and they were appointing somebody as a minister of a church in some Middle Eastern settlement. And the reason that they refused one particular person was, and I quote, "they walked too fast." That was the reason specified. In other words, there was a spirituality associated with this rushing that was not conducive to the work of the minister they were seeking. Yes, Eleanor.
We talked about how some of these practices might strike us as quite difficult to begin with, but actually doing them makes them easier. If you let someone else have their own way, even though you know your way would be better, you do perhaps find that there are benefits in their way, and the more you do it, the easier it is to do that.
Yeah. And I guess not only is it a question of, you know, whose way is better, but there's the loosening the grip of the unending song of ourselves, as I like to talk about it, isn't there? By that, you know, you're no longer in thrall to your own immediate kind of, you know, demands. And it's along with a bit like contemplation that we were talking about last week. You're beginning to put a space between yourself and your reaction, which enables us to be responsive rather than just knee-jerk. Yeah.
Maybe that responds to it, but I was just wondering at what point submission becomes sort of resignation and disengagement, and whether that matters.
I I think the moment it becomes resignation and disengagement is when I would have thought it lacks that intentionality and is no longer kind of when it lacks intentionality and it's not active, because resignation is kind of like whatever, isn't it? Submission is intentional, whereas resignation is, well, whatever. No? It sounds like you're saying whatever there, Lucy.
No, I was just thinking, yeah, I think you're right, but I think it can be a fine line sometimes.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I think people are a bit, iffy about submission, because there are a number of fine lines with submission, aren't there? And, to go the wrong side of the line is, more dangerous than with many of the other practices.
Mm.
Yeah.
We were talking about that because we were talking about how submission, how it can easily become a doormat.
Yeah.
And then we were surmising that really, if it's also discerning whether something is of God, because if people are going to be treating you that badly, we're thinking particularly of how, people have been almost abused and sort of almost battered into submission, is a very different matter, isn't it? But it's in one's
absolutely.
mind that it can.
Yeah. And that's why there's wisdom in starting these things with very small things. I mean, which is why some of the ideas I was coming up with are nothing like that kind of that kind of level of vulnerability. It's, simply, as I say, not necessarily having the last word. I mean, that it's, going into a meeting, framing it in terms of how can I enable these people to be the best they can be, rather than me being a shining star here kind of thing and stuff. So there are kind of like, there are different levels, aren't there, to the vulnerability to which we're opening ourselves in terms of the different kinds of submission we're offering.
And I suppose that's where the intentionality comes in, because it's something that you've already intending to do. Whereas if you're put into a situation of perhaps submitting to something against your will, that's a different.
Yeah. And remember that, I guess, that, in Ephesians 5, there's a mutuality about it. And, where it really thrives and where it really takes off is where there is that mutuality to submission, isn't there? That's where you begin to see, the real healthiness of a Christian community. Whereas, a lot of the time, unfortunately, Christian communities can mirror every other human community where it's a kind of competition and getting my way. So there's no mutuality at all. Yeah. What about sharing joy? Any thoughts? Oh, you're all looking a bit glum. Sarah.
Well, Diane and I talked about sharing joy, perhaps in a church setting. Your picture demonstrated one or two things with eating together, and we thought of singing together and praying together and all of those things which are kind of ingrained into our liturgy with the Eucharist in the centre. But we then went on to talk about the sort of informal things that happen that are along the same sort of lines, and how you get that balance right between the formal and the informal in terms of generating joy in your membership.
Yeah. And of course, I didn't preface it with this, but joy, I would argue, is at the heart of the Christian faith. And it's a little odd if we are entirely joyless as a people. I mean, joy is an awareness and an experience of a matchless goodness that's able to transform all of our moments, as Paul showed, which is why sharing joy as a practice comes later than the earlier practices about noticing God, because it's the kind of God we notice that means we are able to practice joy, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And it's in view of that we have that sense of the matchless goodness that can transform even our darkest moments. Of course, today is St. John of the Cross, isn't it? Today we celebrate St. John of the Cross. It's his feast day. Now there's a person who was transformed utterly by the matchless goodness of God in Christ. He was, I don't know if you know, but he was locked up in a cupboard for a very long time by some friars who didn't like the monastic reforms he was undertaking in Spain with Teresa of Avila. And that was where some of his finest poetry came out of. Lost to myself I stayed, my face upon my lover's breast having laid, from all my endeavours ceasing and all my cares releasing, threw them amongst the lilies, there to fade. Now that's joy in a matchless goodness when he's locked in a cupboard for 9 months. Boom. Now, I'm not suggesting we can reach such dizzy heights, but I'm just giving that as an example of kind of like the reservoir of joy that is available in the Christian faith, which we might want to kind of draw on. Pat?
It's just something that's been in my mind as I've been discussing in the group and hearing what you're saying. There used to be a saying, smile, it might be catching. Share your joy and it might be catching.
Yeah, mirror neurons, here we come. Yeah, well, that minister that I was talking about and the welcomers, I mean, it's simple things sometimes and simple practices, but, you know, and it is well known that if you smile, your mood is changed, you know, not the kind of plastic, artificial kind of I'm not really smiling, but the genuine smile, you know, yeah.
Oh, it's so frustrating when you can't show your smile with the mask.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. I
think it struck me the joy is something that we give. So as well as feel. So if we are not joyful, if we are joyful, it certainly impacts the people around us. So it's something that we offer and give to others. So that's what struck me this evening.
Yeah. And the other thing I guess I'd want to say about joy is it's related to other practices. And the biggest one it's related to is the one we started with in week 1, gratitude. Gratitude is the foundation of an awful lot of joy. And grateful people are joyful people. So, you know, if you want an engine for joy, it's gratitude and appreciation.
Yes, Sarah linked the two when we were talking. Yeah,
absolutely. But as I say, as Christians, you know, we've got the matchless goodness we see in God in Christ. We've got the joy of our hope. We've got the joy that actually comes through finding and inhabiting a sense of purpose in our life and work, which echoes to eternity. So it's kind of, you know, there's joy in all sorts of dimensions. And the interesting thing about grasping that joy is then we can kind of like be freed a little bit from our insistent voices saying we have a right and a need to be entertained, and we're constantly searching for increasing levels of sort of drama and its effects on our minds and hearts. Do you know what I mean? We're freed from that with the joy. Anyway, I'm getting a bit preachy now, so I better stop.
I think joy also draws people in. I mean, I remember way back, before I was a Christian, there were Christians that were just so joyful, just like a magnet, you know, you're just drawn to them. And it's always stayed with me. So whenever we serve, we kind of think about, you know, what do we look like? Are we joyful? Is our joy bringing hope to those around us, I suppose?
Yeah, it was Paul Aguda, the New Testament scholar, who said one of the reasons Christianity spread is that glass windows hadn't been invented. So that, you know, in the urban areas, houses were so close together that people could hear what was going on in the Christian houses, the extended families, amongst which was laughter and joy between slaves and their masters. Strange. Thank the Lord, Pilkington glass arrived late. Right. And on that substantially serious note, I think, shall we have a couple more? Couple more? Okay, let's go for a couple more. Let's share the screen encore une fois. Here we go now. Right. Now, you might want to mute because I heard somebody sigh heavily just then. Here we go. So, but sighing heavily is, I'm afraid, appropriate for our next practice, which is lament. David Runcorn, the writer, relates the story of a man praying in the aftermath of 9/11. He recalls what the man said. The man said, "Oh Lord, I just do not know what you are playing at. What are you doing?" Runcorn said that kind of prayer subverted the atmosphere of the prayer meeting and made people feel uncomfortable. But Runcorn also said that man hadn't yet learned how Christians usually pray about such things. I hope he never does. What the man was praying was a prayer of lament. And lament involves a number of dimensions. It is a passionate expression of grief and sorrow, but it's also a kind of complaint. And we've got to be careful what we mean by complaint here, because it's not a sort of critical undermining or undoing of the other, but a kind of this isn't right complaint, a sort of protesting that which is ungodly, that which is against God's purposes, and protesting that this appears to hold sway and it puts in question God's way with the world. But it's actually motivated by an awareness of the character, the nature, and the previous actions of God. So it shifts from complaint then to petition, to the groaning of the Holy Spirit in Romans 8, if you like, and joining our tears with God's tears. And so somehow seeking and perhaps enabling God to work through us. So lament can involve grief, involve complaint, involve petition, and remembering too. Because lament involves remembering God's previous actions, remembering God's promises, and so being reorientated to God coming to our aid. So complaint, petition, motivation, hope. So there's quite a lot in lament. It's not just grief. It's not just complaint. It's not just petition. But it's a kind of combination of these things. In relation to this, in the 1970s, Russ Parker, who some of you know, an ordained colleague of mine, tells of how when he was a curate, his vicar's wife was killed in a car accident, aged only 27. An articulated lorry crushed her mini car. And at the funeral, her husband, who was taking the funeral, whether advisedly or not, he was lamenting. He was saying to the gathered congregation, his actual church congregation, he said, "I've no idea why this happened. I have asked God and I can see no possible reason for this. There is no thread of meaning or purpose to this tragedy." And so he went on, to the point that Russ Parker, my friend, as a curate, wanted to interrupt and somehow offer a yes, but, as clearly he noticed other members of the congregation did and were feeling progressively more uncomfortable. But the lament went on until the vicar came up with his own but. He said, "I don't know how to find meaning in this, but I do know that Jesus rose from the dead, and I do know that our horizon is not physical death, but something much broader, much wider, much longer. And knowing that helps me to live with what I don't know. Now that seems like lament to me. And lament can indeed be a practice for navigating unanswered and indeed unanswerable questions. I also think that what that vicar said is a really helpful kind of thumbnail sketch of mystery. And mystery in the scriptures, in the New Testament, doesn't mean what we often use it to mean, which is don't really know and it's a bit fuzzy, so I'll call it a mystery. What mystery means in scripture is more precise than that. Mystery in scripture is that which has been revealed, which I know, against a larger background of that which I do not know and has not been revealed. Do you see? So mystery is kind of a revealing and a knowing of something against a backdrop of a wider unknowing and unrevealing. So he could talk about the resurrection being revealed, but the background of these unanswered questions, such as his wife's death, remained. This was the mystery that he was encountering. Now, one of the dangers with lament is we short-circuit it. And just like that vicar, I think, we need to linger on the questions and not move too quickly to hope and praise with this practice. Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, said, "It's a curious fact that the church has, by and large, continued to sing songs of orientation in a world increasingly experiencing disorientation." And I'm coming to the practice of confession next, but there are various versions of confession which can be lament focused on this disorientation rather than our own individual shortcomings. Here's one that I took from that book, little worship book at the bottom there, Sowing in Tears, which is a lovely little book on lament by Paul Bradbury. And he says, you know, if you are putting together a Christian service and you're thinking about a confession, sometimes instead of talking about the individual's confession, you could actually use a kind of lament version. And here's one that is a lament. Your world is broken and diseased. We are a part of that world. We weep at the injustice, the poverty and the pain. Lord, have mercy. Do you see the different emphasis rather than our own individual shortcomings? Incidentally, for those of you who are interested, there is a service of lament in the book New Patterns of Worship, which is quite good, but there's a question as to whether, unlike the Psalms, it too falls prey to the temptation to introduce a theme of hope too early, and so actually, ironically, runs the risk of diluting the impact of hope and salvation breaking in at the end. Past masters at lament were Francis of Assisi and Clare of Assisi, who used to spend weekends weeping a river together, which to the more kind of pragmatic minded of us might seem a fairly unuseful way of spending their time. But there was something about Francis and Clare weeping in lament that joined their tears to God's tears and seems to have enabled God to work through them in ways that he did not work through the more pragmatically minded. What did Ephraim the Syrian say? Weep. There is no other way. There's something about entering into lament fully in an extended manner, acting out that dynamic of complaint to petition to hope that participates in God in a way that's spiritually transfiguring. So lament. And again, a countercultural practice. There is not much room in this world for lament. We want to rush on to get to a solution, to make it better. Or alternatively, we are stuck in complaint and grumbling. One more, and then we can have a little conversation about these two, which is confession. Confession. Now, confession is about presenting our real self to God with all its inadequacies and flaws in the company of a trusted person or trusted other persons. The former head of the Reformed Church in the USA, which is a much bigger church than the Anglican Church, Wes Granberg Mickelson, wrote this book, Leadership from the Inside Out, and emphasizes that indispensable to the practice of trustworthy ministry is a safe place of trust, where virtually anything you need to share about your journey can be done in an atmosphere of safety, counsel, and support. Might be a small group, might be a spiritual director, might be a soul friend, but the importance of being able to level with someone, to confess indeed, is vital. And not least, of course, because things are not in us the way we want them to be, at least not all the time. And when we don't come up to our own expectations or those of others or what we think God expects of us, then the temptation, the danger is we might deal with it by trying to manage it or hide it ourselves. Incidentally, a sign we're taking charge of our lives, that it's our kingdom come, not thy kingdom come. And of course, managing it and hiding it creates a considerable burden, and we can invest a very large amount of energy on defense, self-justification, and the like. And the idea of confession goes completely in the opposite direction to this. When we confess, we submit, we surrender our kingdom to God's kingdom. We no longer defend and justify. We no longer manage or hide or all the rest. We say this is the way things are, which of course is good for the soul and bad for the reputation. But it has to be said, in Christian terms, a lot of reputation isn't really very good for us. It's manning the facades, isn't it? A lot of reputation, manning the facades, keeping us in unreal relationships full of pretense. It seems to me that our fellowship and our small groups as Christians should be aiming at the point where we don't need to pretend. And confession, I would want to suggest, is a really big breakthrough here, and arguably one of the points of distinction, potentially, about the Christian fellowship. And of course, funnily enough, in the history of Christianity, confession and the breakthrough of Christianity is a means of revival and a vehicle of God's reviving spirit. I'm always fond of quoting Jonathan Goforth here, who, with a name like that, you can imagine, is indeed a missionary and was a missionary to China in the early 1900s, experiencing a tremendous revival among missionaries and the population there. And he notes in his autobiography, it all came about when missionaries broke down and confessed to one another. Confessed they didn't love one another. They said bad things about one another. They were jealous of one another, in competition with one another. Goes all the way back to James and John, Jesus' disciples. And over and again, we see breakthroughs in church history around confession. Not least, I would suggest, because that's one moment when we surrender and say, you know what? Thy kingdom come, thy kingdom come. That is the moment we begin to trust in God's kingdom and put ourselves into it. And it's odd that confession is difficult for us as a practice, because we know theoretically that Jesus draws a line between the past and our future. We can get stuck in the past, a moment of shame or sorrow, regret, stuck and unable to step into tomorrow because we've not dealt with yesterday. And it doesn't help that we do live in a fairly unforgiving culture where, for example, if we're not the person we want to be or what others want us to be, or not the person we think God expects us to be, we don't anticipate forgiveness. So we try to hide our brokenness, our shame and the like, try to manage our lives in ways which unfortunately raise our blood pressure, add to our burden and take a lot of energy. Whereas we know, theoretically at least, that following Jesus is different. We come before him and in worship we confess, we say, this is how it is and this is who I am and I'm sorry for this and this. And I would like, Lord, to resume my intimacy with you in a way that means there is nothing between us. I do not want to carry the heavy burden of self-justification, of denial or the like. I want to rejoice in being with you and allow you to carry my burden. It is simple. It's not as if we have to make a huge song and dance going on and on about being sorry. The father of the prodigal son didn't require a song and dance from his son. The son had rehearsed a song and a dance, but didn't get beyond "Father, I have sinned" before his father interrupted him to get the celebration going. So I suppose what I'm saying about the practice of confession is it's a good idea. Avail yourself of it. It is not about punishment. It is about healing. And there are varieties of confession. There is, of course, the formal confession within worship that we collectively undertake. There is confession with a spiritual director. There is a formal sacramental confession. And I do recommend that if you can find somebody to confess to, a trusted advisor, that's a good thing to do. Because there's something about confessing out loud to another person that puts it out there. There's something about putting it out there that separates it. And there's no confusion. Forgiveness comes from God, and it's not about forgiveness coming from somebody else. But we do need, as human beings, to be told and to hear that voice loud and clear, a voice truer, louder, and more tangible than the accusing voices within telling us we're not forgiven. So I would commend it to you to practice it. And you may say, well, I can't go that far, flipping heck, I can't go that far. And if you can't go that far, then, well, you could always make a start. How can you make a start? Well, I guess one of the ways is to think about how we can have less and less pretense in our lives. Yeah. Someone asks you if you've read a book and you haven't, then just say, I don't know that author. Haven't read that book. Don't pretend to know people you don't know. Or is it, as Paul says in Romans 12, don't claim to be wiser than you are. These practices are steps on the road to full-blown confession, all part and parcel of claiming and being honest with your limitations. And I would suggest this kind of habit can help you to own weaknesses and to begin to let others know our weaknesses and flaws, giving them permission to be similarly real, nourishing all the while a trusting faith in God's loving provision for our needs. And it has the added bonus of making us more lovable. Henri Nouwen took years to find out that the idea he had to make himself so amazing that no one would have any reason not to love him was a pretty false trail. So, steps to take on the way to confession. Now, let me see if I can come out of there. Now, we've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm wondering if I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes in the small groups just to talk. So there was only lament and confession there. So I'm going to recreate these rooms. and just give you 4 minutes or so, and then we'll come back. Okay, just to talk about those. Anything grab you in those two? What thoughts arose? You know how it works. So I'll open the rooms. Do you want a beverage?
What we need is a girl party. Hi.
That's the sugar for the week.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, close all rooms. Just wait to be joined. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So, again, with lament and confession. Any thoughts or reflections or questions arising? Bit of a contrast from sharing joy, I'll grant you. Any yellow hands going up anywhere?
It doesn't show up on my screen.
Ah, Pat,
It's
carry
blue.
on.
The one thing that came over in both laments and confessions to me, which I've sort of shared in the group, is it's getting rid of pretense. It's looking for truth and reality. With confession, it's not sort of, it's not saying the words and think, wow, God has forgiven me. It's actually being real in his presence, the confession. Not trying to wipe it away yourself by confessing, but let him do that. And you know when it happens.
Yeah, yeah. And to understand that God meets us in reality and
Yes.
nowhere else.
And we don't have to be perfect because we're not. We just do our best. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Elka.
I think we ran out of time really, but I think what we're all coming to is that having that permission to lament and not rush it. You were saying about rushing earlier, and I think and I do it at funerals. You know, I say to people, you have permission. They feel they have to apologize because they're sorrowful or they're sad. And somebody also mentioned about us actually having that permission, that sometimes the Victorians didn't do everything always wrong. You know, that wearing black, in a way, gave people that permission to be able to lament. And it's not, we weren't meaning sort of just to do it, but I think because we're rushing away from it, we then can't get to the hope because we get very disappointed very quickly, if that makes sense.
It does make perfect sense. And I think that it was a really telling story, that the Russ Parker story of being a curate and wanting his vicar to rush on.
Yes.
And the pressure in the congregation as well to rush on, make it better, and actually how that would have short-circuited the lament. So it's difficult to sustain that practice without kind of truncating it. Yeah. Anything else anybody's got, or have I driven you to silence? Another good practice.
So much to think about.
Sarah.
I don't know much about confession in the church scenario, but as a gynecologist, I've spent the last 40 years listening to people with their sex problems. And I don't think the church is terribly good when it comes to sex problems.
I think you're right. I remember my first formal sacramental confession. And I was a bit nervous about it. You can imagine I was a young curate and I went along as a deacon to this monk who was my spiritual director, and I confessed to him. And I was a little bit wounded when he began to fall asleep halfway through my confession. I was also comforted to think that it was so ordinary that that he didn't feel he needed to stay alert through it. But I then realized the error of my ways and never booked him again for a 2:30 in the afternoon slot after his lunchtime, which is the big meal for the monks in that particular monastery. So yeah, I don't know why I come up with that just after you've said that, Sarah. But there you go.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that that I do very much better as a gynecologist. Some things made it easier. Having some privacy made it easier. But we were still really bad at talking about domestic violence issues, which are incredibly endemic. Abortion is such a common procedure. Something like 200,000 women a year in England and Wales have abortions, and that's not something that's particularly discussed in a church culture. There's a lot that goes on which we simply don't really have any real connection with in church.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, this goes back to the Wes Granberg-Mickelson point about where are the safe spaces and where are the trustworthy spaces. And this is really important to find ourselves, because the context for confession has to be a safe place and a place of trust. Anything else?
Divorce is another one which is incredibly endemic. And I don't think people would think that church is the natural place to talk about those things, but I may be wrong.
Well, yeah, there's a danger we sort of church as the place. Yeah, certainly not. I don't think anybody would go to a church and just start talking about something as intimate as their divorce in a church. But so the question is, I guess, the challenge for us as Christian community is how we develop the kind of trusting relationships so that we can talk about whatever it is that we need to be able to talk about. So yeah. Dorothy, and then I think we might have to draw stumps. Dorothy?
I was going to remind people of places like Lee Abbey and Scargill House in Yorkshire, where they have divorce recovery weeks for people who have been divorced. And this is the church doing it in a specialist sense rather than in the local parish. And those, I've had so many comments from people who've been on those who said that that's real, those sort of meeting places with the right guidance have been so helpful to divorced people.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our time is nearly up. I have a little piece of music to conclude with, which I'll show you as a slide, if it will work, which is just a bit of nice music, really. But we've got one more session next week, 7 o'clock. And some practices of abstinence next week, so to keep you sober and vigilant in the 4th week of Lent. Okay, so we'll look at those next week. But meanwhile, I'm hoping this might work. Blessings and good night.
Thank you.
Number one would always be me. I thought I could be what I wanted to be. I thought I could build on life's sinking sand, but I can't even walk without you holding my hand. me less than a man. I can't even walk without you holding my hand. I can't even walk without you holding my hand. The mountain's too high and the valley's too wide. Down on my knees, I learned to say that I can't even walk without you holding my hand. Down on my knees, I've learned to say I can't even walk without you holding my hand. No, I can't even walk without you holding my hand.
Good night.